Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. The FIA have confirmed they're looking at major regulation updates after the main benefit, theoretically, of the 2022 regulations, the reduction of dirty air, therefore making it easier for cars to follow others, has pretty much been null and voided over the last couple of seasons, with a massive increase in dirty air seen so far here in 2023. Regulation changes, therefore, are going to be happening. Toto Wolff and the Mercedes PR machine are up in full force as well, trying to find a way where these changes might hurt Red Bull more than all the other cars. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Now here's Daniel Ricciardo on his recovery journey. If you're very squeamish, then look away, but otherwise I think this should be pretty fine. This is Daniel Ricciardo's hand surgery aftermath, shall we say. So, well, we can see the stitches and everything here. Now this looks pretty bad. Of course, you know, it's a flesh wound, right? We can't see what's going on inside and whether his hand is fixed and the broken metacarpal is okay now. How long he's got to recovery, we don't really know. Singapore, it's not going to happen. I think it was even spotted that Liam Lawson's name is on the garage for AlphaTauri in Singapore, so no chance of that happening, it seems. And Qatar also, well, Qatar might be the return, with Japan after Singapore seeming unlikely. So that would mean 6 more races for Daniel Ricciardo from then to the end of the season. And there are some questions as to what's going to happen in that AlphaTauri team. There is no driver currently locked down for that team. None of the drivers have a contract that goes beyond this season. And this is what I was saying a few days ago now about Yuki Tsunoda. The rumour is that his seat might be the one under threat, which feels surprising because he's been very good. But at the end of the day, 3 years in the AlphaTauri, Red Bull, sister team, whatever, is quite a lot if you're not getting promoted up to the main Red Bull team, which I don't think Tsunoda will, at least immediately. Perez probably will stay, or maybe they get Norris. That's been the rumour of the last couple of days. But with Lawson performing very well, and apparently AlphaTauri's CEO very much wanting Ricciardo, and the other part about Ricciardo is that even if Tsunoda is experienced, as is Ricciardo, but especially because they're going to become Hugo Boss Bulls Racing or whatever, like Ricciardo's just the ideal guy to have if he isn't going to Red Bull to actually be the face of your brand. So it's kind of looking like Lawson versus Tsunoda for the second seat, and it's a real shame for Yuki that his engine blew up on the out lap or the formation lap at Monza, because Lawson looked pretty good that race, but maybe he was just mediocre and actually the car was really good and Yuki would have got points with it. It's difficult to say, and that's unfortunate for both drivers really. We couldn't have a benchmark for them to be against. Now, speaking of the Red Bull situation, there is a follow-up here from Helmut Marko. Now, I discussed the other day comments from Helmut Marko that Sergio Perez wasn't as focused as Verstappen or Vettel, or isn't as focused because he is South American. Now, at the time, there was some discussion on whether there was something lost in translation here, but it turns out that no, it's not the case at all, because in Helmut Marko's apology, he says, yeah, that's what I said, and kind of apologized for it. It's outrageous stuff, to be honest. I mean, so first of all, obviously Perez is Mexican, like that's not in South America. And even if he was, I mean, come on, like Fangio, even Nelson Piquet, but Senna, right? All South American drivers, like, you know, come on with this BS that these guys aren't as focused because they're South American. I simply, you know, it's just shocking statements, really. And, you know, deserves the criticism that he got over the last few days. Now, he comes out with an apology, which he's definitely written himself, that says, I would like to apologize for my offensive remark and want to make it absolutely clear that I do not believe that we can generalize about the people from any country, any race, any ethnicity. I was trying to make a point that Checo has fluctuated in his performance this year, but it was wrong to attribute this to his cultural heritage. So basically says, yeah, that is exactly what I did. It wasn't mistranslated, and yeah, my bad. So, you know, another classic shocking quote here from Helmut Marko. And honestly, Perez deserves better than to get treated like this, I think, by members of his own team. But, you know, that's how Red Bull operates sometimes. Now, speaking of Red Bull, the Haas have decided, well, Haas as a team have decided it's time to go on their car, and they will make a Red Bull copy. Apparently, they're going to introduce one at the Austin Grand Prix, which is, it's a sprint race, is it not, at Austin, which maybe you could argue isn't the best place to introduce a B-spec car without all the practice, but whatever. They are going to bring along a car that apparently, from the underbody, from the side pods, from the engine cover, looks very much like the Red Bull. So they've probably given up on their current car design a long time ago now, and are going all in on a copy of the Red Bull, which they hope is going to work. So that'll be very interesting to see come Austin, whether that actually works or whether it doesn't. But one thing that hasn't been working particularly well, it's got to be said, are the current set of regulations. I recently watched again the 2022 regulations like hype video that Formula 1 did, and the 3 points they made was that the racing is going to be way less predictable, which clearly isn't the case. Remember, I've won every race this year. There's going to be more teams racing for victories, clearly not the case. Remember, I've won every race this year. And the final one was that the quality of the racing is going to be better, easier to follow, easier to make overtakes, less necessity for DRS, that type of stuff. And that was the case, undisputedly, I think, at the start of last season. As the last 2 years have gone on, even that third point that these new regulations are meant to bring, I don't think is necessarily true anymore at all, really. Now, this was a comment made by Sainz, especially way back in Jeddah. The second race of this season, the drivers were trying to follow other cars through Sector 1, and they were like, this doesn't feel like last year. We can't follow as closely. We're losing a lot of downforce through the dirty air. And it reminded drivers of what they felt in 2020 and 2021 when the dirty air effect was at its worst. Just a quick explainer here. The same reason why you get a slipstream on the straight is what happens in the corners when that air is going over your wings, but it's not having the same effect. And therefore, you're losing lots of downforce when you're following a car closely behind. And it was the major problem the regulations tried to solve in 2022. But the problem is that, as you might have predicted, the teams are chucking downforce on the car left, right, and center. They're finding every way, front wing, rear wing, every element they can to put more downforce on, and that's creating more dirty air that was meant to be alleviated by more of the downforce coming from the floor. But the reality is that we're going back to a situation where things look an awful lot like pre-2022. Some will blame, maybe for good reason, TD39 that Toto Wolff pushed for, raising the ride heights to counter the porpoising, and that reduced the effectiveness of the floor and therefore increased the necessity for downforce elsewhere. But frankly, even if TD39 didn't happen, the teams would still have been piling on every single inch of downforce they can to the car, and they'll continue to do the same thing next year. And that means, from the aerodynamic elements, more dirty air, less ability to follow in the corners. That's where we then get to today, and F1 is now ready to act on this. They've seen enough evidence to show that, yes, the main reason why we brought these regulations in is effectively getting to a point where it's just not really relevant anymore. The cars are pretty much as bad to follow as they were pre-2022, and they're going to need to act. Now, the issue is they can't act on this immediately because teams have already committed a lot of resources to next season. The teams would shut it down and say, no, we're not accepting any changes. So next year's cars, the regulations will be identical, but for the year after in 2025, the FIA are looking at some tweaks. Now, these are the key numbers here. So in 2021, if you're 2 lengths from the car in front, you're losing like 50% of your aero load. In 2022, that was only 20%, a massive reduction, and in theory, that worked rather well. The issue is, when the teams put on more downforce, we're now at 35%. That's only 1 year in. I mean, think next year, without these changes, we're going to be 40, 45, who knows, right? It's going to be pretty close, you'd think, to that 50% figure, which basically means that there's been no realistic improvement in how well the cars can actually follow. Carlos Sainz has made this point as well, as have pretty much every driver. Trying to follow other cars is becoming very challenging this season. And if the teams have closed that gap by half in just 1 year, then action is necessary. So the article goes on to describe here what they could and potentially should do about it, saying they're looking at, the end plate of the front wing, different parts of the floor, fins around the wheels, to try and change these elements to ensure, make more restrictive rules, being more restrictive. Again, lots of arguments. People would say that the rules are too restrictive already anyway, but they're going to try and do things to ensure that more of the downforce comes from the floor and some of the other downforce is thrown out, which, could be a good thing and should be a good thing, but the teams will always find a way. And there is a very solid argument to make right now that this set of regulations, given what they were intended to achieve, have effectively failed. Yes, we got races such as Bahrain 2022, Austria, let's say 2022, where you did have these multiple lap battles, lap on lap. But nowadays, you don't see as much of that really at all anymore. And actually comparing some of the overtaking figures, now there are obviously some outliers here, right? Like Netherlands this year was ridiculous. And for example, even races like Saudi Arabia, when Verstappen is starting way out of position, he's going to make a lot of overtakes. So, and even like Spain, for example, they changed the final chicane. So you're going to see more overtakes this year. And overtakes does not necessarily equate to enjoyment of the race, because in Italy there was only 31 overtakes, but there were plenty of overtake attempts and opportunities in Monza, which made things interesting. But this is just a comparison between last year and this year. And I would say that at most tracks, considering there are some outliers in play, especially cars out of position and stuff like this, we've generally seen quite significantly less overtakes, I would say, this year compared to last year. And I think that is one of the contributing factors. Not everywhere, of course, it varies dramatically, but I think in general, that is a trend that is ongoing and is a trend which is likely to continue unless things happen. So the FIA say 2025, we're going to cut this down and make changes to get back to, shall we say, the spirit of the regulations or the intention of the regulations as they were first written. Now, Mercedes' PR machine is in full force at the moment. Toto Wolff, Hamilton, like they're all at it, right? And so probably will Ferrari be in short order to try and find a way of, getting Red Bull to get kind of curtailed in some respects. So Toto Wolff is talking about how, and this did happen to Mercedes, and you can very well argue that this was justified because Mercedes going into 2021 had just won 7 years in a row of constructors titles. They made some changes that helped the higher rake design of the Red Bull rather than the lower rake of the Mercedes. Newey said after 2021 that over the course of the season, their car was the strongest and those regulations had favoured them. So the theory is that the FIA made changes to try and stop Mercedes in 2021, and they succeeded in some respects. That's not to say that changes intended to slow a team down always work, because they certainly don't, but sometimes they do. And as Toto Wolff says, they made the change to stop us. We could see the results in 2021, and they were clearly targeted to re-establish the pecking order. If a team dominates the way Max has done with Red Bull, then fair dues, and says that, we won't cry foul over that domination, but we have suffered in the past. So, by saying they won't cry foul, in some respects, he's kind of crying foul and saying, look, we had to suffer some regulation changes that affected us because we were the dominant car. Maybe the same thing should happen to Red Bull. Now, they will go next year into their third season of dominance, you could argue, in this set of regulations, if they continue to dominate going into 2024, and maybe that's not the same as 7 constructors titles in a row for Mercedes. But nonetheless, some would say that if you are going to make changes for 2025, at least have an eye towards trying to affect things that Red Bull are using to maximize their advantage. The issue is, I think, with this, is that the Red Bull is so good, and there are obviously certain elements that are really powerful with the Red Bull, but there's nothing you can point at to say, oh, that's a safety concern. Oh, this is the one thing they're doing that nobody else can do, therefore let's change that. It's much more complicated than that. So I don't think that even if the FIA were blatantly outright trying to find ways to slow down Red Bull with these tweaks they make, I'm not even sure they'd necessarily be successful. But still, it could make things interesting for 2025, the 1 year before the 2026 regulations, as Verstappen currently is closing in on yet another record. The current record for most consecutive podiums is Michael Schumacher at 19. Hamilton has 16. Alonso has 15. Verstappen already at 15. So it's probably going to take a DNF, to be honest, for this not to be the case. But last year in Singapore was also a bit of a nightmare for Max. So we'll see if the same thing recurs again. But very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. I don't usually comment on the images that I chuck at the end of the video, but this is indeed like a special McDonald's menu that they're making for Checo out in Mexico. So pretty funny stuff. But hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.